Hello and welcome to the Kubernetes podcast from Google. I'm your host, Caslin Fields.
And I am Abdel Sigiwa.
In this episode, we interviewed Priyanka Saggu, Kubernetes version 1.29 release lead and SIG Contribex tech lead. We spoke about the release, the new features and enhancements, and more. But first, let's get to the news.
The Kyverno project has completed a third-party security audit conducted by Adalogics in collaboration with the Kyverno maintainers. In total, 6 CVEs were assigned during the audit. 4 of these had their root cause in the Notary Verifier, which had not been released prior to the audit. One of the findings was in a third-party dependency to Kyverno and was fixed by the co-signed project maintainers. The Kyverno maintainers have quickly addressed all issues found during the audit, with fixes incorporated in Kyverno 1.10.6 and 1.11.1.
Google Cloud announced their new Gemini AI model. On top of being Google's largest and most advanced AI model to date, Gemini is built with multimodality. It can reason across text, images, video, audio, and code. Gemini comes in 3 versions: Nano for on-device tasks, Pro for general tasks, and Ultra, the most capable of the 3. Google ran 32 well-established benchmarks comparing Gemini to GPT-4 and described it as being substantially ahead on 30 out of 32. Check out the model yourself today through Google Bard.
The Linux Foundation has announced its intent to form the High Performance Software Foundation, HPSF, to advance high-performance computing. HPSF aims to develop a portable software stack for HPC, making it more accessible and fostering collaboration in development.
The call for papers, or CFP, for the Open Source Summit North America is open until January 14th, 2024. The event will take place in Seattle, Washington from April 16th to 18th, 2024.
The App Defense Alliance, initially established by Google for Android app security, has now joined the Joint Development Foundation under the Linux Foundation. The new alliance brings together technology leaders like Google, Meta, and Microsoft as the steering committee. The alliance aims to strengthen app security across various platforms and foster collaborative implementations of industry-wide standards.
And that's the news. All right. Welcome to the show, Priyanka Saggu. I'm very excited to be talking about the 1.29 release this time. But first, could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Hey everyone. Hello, Caslin. My name is Priyanka Saggu. I work at SUSE as a Kubernetes integration engineer, and I do a lot of stuff in upstream as well. Currently, like Caslin already introduced, I am the release lead for Kubernetes 1.29 release cycle. I'm also a technical lead for Kubernetes Special Interest Group Contributor Experience alongside Caslin,
where we work together closely because I'm a co-chair. So co-chair and tech lead, it's like same level.
Yeah.
Folks not familiar.
Yeah. And I'm also one of the GitHub admins for Kubernetes and subproject orgs.
Yeah, you do so many things.
Hey, I'm learning. Yeah.
Our tech leads do such cool stuff in SIG Contribex because SIG contributor experience is all about making sure that folks contributing to Kubernetes have the processes and tools that they need to contribute. So being a GitHub admin is like a core part of the technical side of SIG contributor experience because it's a lot of stuff around like how the community uses GitHub, right? And I'm always amazed at the stuff you all do.
Yeah, I recently was nominated as one of the GitHub admins, so even I'm surprised like how many things goes into being a GitHub admin. There is a lot of stuff.
Also, it's open source, so I feel like a lot of open source is just kind of, congratulations, you have a job now, figure it out.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I feel about being co-chair, at least.
All of this feels like a full-time job most times.
Yeah. I remember when we were doing the lead cohort, when we were working with the previous leads of SIG Contribex to kind of get familiar with the role and everything. It was like, great, so what am I in charge of now? I asked one day. And the previous leads were like, well, there's this and there's that and the other thing. And I was like, it's just everything, isn't it? And you don't know exactly where it begins and ends, do you?
Mm-hmm. I still ask the same questions, I think, a few weeks back to, I think, Bob, who was the previous lead chair. And I was like, oh, I'm a lead now. What all I'm supposed to take care of?
So what do I do?
Yeah. And I think like he shared, everyone is feeling the same way. And that was
Yep.
Good to hear.
So welcome to open source, where we learn in public, which is what we're going to do today on the release 1.29.
Hey.
At least I'm going to be learning a lot today. I'm very excited to talk about. We talked a little bit about it, and I did a little bit of research leading up to this, so I know there are some very exciting things in this release, which I'm excited to dive into. But before we dive into the changes in the release, let's go over the release theme. What is the theme for this release?
We are calling Kubernetes 1.29 as Mandala, and it's an Indian art form. Mandala is actually, in English, we can call it universe. So actually, I'm calling the release theme as Mandala brackets, the universe, so everyone understand it.
Oh, I love that.
It's an art form from India, and our logo is actually depicting that art form itself. What I'm trying to maybe show with this logo is our little universe of Kubernetes itself, where we have, starting from the release team, 40 team members who are working on making this release happen, backed by hundreds and hundreds of community contributors and everyone, not just contributors, users, supporters who have worked tirelessly to bring this new release to life. So this logo is for all of them.
I feel like it fits perfectly. I'm kind of surprised, honestly, that this has never happened before, because it just feels so perfect to describe the Kubernetes release as kind of its own universe. And mandalas are gorgeous. So
yeah, I will also talk about who created the logo. So this is also created by one of our contributors in the project, Mario Jason Braganza, and we used the base mandala art is actually we took it from someone, Fibrel Ohala. It's a 8 years old art. We found it somewhere on internet, and I'm so happy that this logo is bringing it back to life. So thank you, Fibrel Ohala, if you are listening to this podcast, and thank you, Mario Jason Braganza, to create this logo for us. I love it. Actually, there is a little bit of a secret inside, which is no longer a secret. We already discussed it on Kubernetes Slacks. So if you read the numbers on these 4, what should I say? There are squares, or I think parallelograms on each side of the circle. And if you start reading it from left to right and then bottom, it reads 1.29.
Ooh.
In a script called Annapurna SIL, which is on Devanagari script, Hindi. So that is where we have written down our release numbers there, 1.29. We try to make it part of the mandala art itself. Yeah.
That's so cool. And we'll put a link in the show notes for folks who want to go and see the art. I'm very excited to look at that later. I haven't actually seen it myself yet.
Oh.
And you were saying that this is art that existed previously, but it's been kind of reworked for the 1.29 release. Is that a good way to describe it?
Yeah. Perfect.
Awesome. I'm so excited to look at that art later. And such a great theme.
Thank you.
It's kind of a universe unto itself. Let's talk a bit about what is in that universe. There's quite a few changes in this one, right? How many keps are there, or how many changes?
At the beginning of this cycle, we started with 72, which is...
Whoa. I feel like that's a lot. Is that a lot?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is actually a lot, because the cycle was actually a bit on the shorter side because of a lot of things that happened.
Oh, yeah.
So I was not expecting like this release to be this big in terms of the keps we are tracking. But we got like a huge number. 72 is a big number. And after code freeze now, we are almost a week or two to the final release date, which is December 13th now. And we are tracking 49 keps. So almost 50.
That is also a lot.
That is also a lot.
The release kind of goes in 2 stages, right? As far as these go, where it's like the keps opt in, like, hey, we're totally going to get this into the release this time. And then once you hit code freeze, some of them didn't quite make it. So it kind of reduces a bit, right?
Oh, yeah. Even before code freeze, we have something called enhancements freeze, where all the people like who are actually opting in for their features or any sort of enhancements, they have to have their enhancements, or what do we call a KEP, KEP Kubernetes enhancements proposal. They need to get it merged into a repo. We have Kubernetes/enhancements. So we call that deadline enhancements freeze, and the number goes at that milestone as well. And then we have code freeze, which is where if your code is implemented you are tracked. Otherwise, we have to leave it for other release. Yeah.
Yeah. So to have 49 make it through both enhancement freeze and code freeze is a lot, I feel like. So definitely.
Oh, yeah, it is. And out of those 49, we have 11 stable features or 11 stable enhancements coming in. We have 20 new alpha features coming in this cycle and 18 beta. So, yeah, we have a good spread.
And the deprecations and removals blog is, or like breaking changes blog is already out, right?
Yeah.
Were there any deprecations in this one?
So we did not have any deprecations per se. We had two enhancements that were tracked as of type deprecation removal, I would say. So I can talk about one of them, which is actually a breaking change. And I think the first thing I would love to talk about so that people are aware.
Yeah, definitely.
So we are talking about this KEP called removing entry cloud providers. And for anyone listening, it's KEP number 2395.
We'll put a link in the show notes.
Thank you. So this KEP is going to affect people, some of them, and I want to like give a TLDR who is going to be affected. So anybody who is on Azure, GCE or vSphere. So if anybody has a Kubernetes environment running on Azure, GCE or vSphere cloud provider, and they're looking to upgrade their clusters from a version older than 128, I would say highly recommend to read the blog that's going to come right after our release, the first feature blog, and that's going to tell you what you need to do because this KEP.
Well, before you dive into what the KEP does, to clarify, we were talking about it earlier. And if you're running on Azure, GCE, or vSphere, if you're running your own cluster, so GCE being Google Compute Engine. So if you're running on like AKS or GKE, the control plane is managed by the cloud provider. And so they're probably going to take care of this for you.
Yeah, not the managed ones. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you're doing your own, rolling your own Kubernetes from scratch, and you need to upgrade the cluster like directly on virtual machines in Azure, GCE, or vSphere. And if you're, well, I guess even if you're not using the cloud provider plugin features, this might cause you trouble. So let's talk about why that is.
Yeah. I would actually start with what this KEP is actually about and what is happening then in 129. So this KEP started with a discussion in 2018 where Kubernetes community actually created a SIG called Cloud Provider SIG, and the only mission of that SIG was to externalize cloud provider integrations we have in tree inside our Kubernetes source code, and to remove all those cloud providers and make them available as out of tree implementations. So in January 2019, the SIG came up with a draft KEP, and that was approved by the community, and that's where all started. After we are talking about 2019 and we are in 2023 now. After so many years of development and collaboration, this is the first time in 129 when this change will start affecting people, because on a basic level, what this change is coming out in 129 is we are flipping the values of two flags that are actually used at Kube API server or Kube controller manager and kubelet level. One of those flags is disable cloud providers, which actually disables any functionality in Kube API server or Kube controller manager and kubelet related to this flag called cloud providers. So before 129, if you were to use any of these cloud providers, you would use this cloud provider flag in pass, for example, AWS, Azure, GCE, but that's no longer going to work once you are on 129. And the other flag is disable kubelet cloud credentials provider, which disables the entry functionality in kubelet to authenticate to a cloud provider container registry for image pull requests. So collectively, these two flags, now they will be defaulting to true values, and what will happen is this cloud provider command line flag will only understand one value called external. So all the implementations we had for in-tree cloud provider integrations, they no longer will work after 129. So if anybody who is on Azure, GCE, or vSphere, they are going to be impacted and they will need to take some remedy steps. And the blog is going to talk about what needs to be done and with multiple options for whatever is going to be favorable in your situation.
And we've talked about this in-tree versus out-of-tree concept before, especially with releases. There's been a lot of work going on in the community for years, working on taking things that were originally developed in the Kubernetes code base that aren't really part of Kubernetes, like these cloud provider plugins or the storage provider plugins, which we've talked about on previous episodes. Even the Gateway API is kind of an extension of this concept of as much stuff as possible. If it doesn't need to be in Kubernetes, then it should be outside of Kubernetes. Because if it's inside of Kubernetes, then it has to deal with the Kubernetes release process, and a lot more folks have to work together. And it just causes a lot of trouble for everyone involved, both on the Kubernetes side and on the side of whoever's developing that tool. So the whole community has been going through this process of taking things that were originally developed as part of Kubernetes, like the storage provider plugins, the cloud provider plugins, and making them true plugins, taking them out of Kubernetes itself and making them something that you have to pull in from outside. So that's what's happening here. The cloud provider plugins still exist, but they aren't delivered as part of Kubernetes itself. So Kubernetes has to work with a separate tool, kind of the separate plugin, in order to get that functionality. So what the functionality did basically is like, it's possible to run your own cluster in any cloud provider pretty much, as long as you have hardware, right? As long as you have machines that have a compatible kernel, you can run a Kubernetes cluster across them, and Kubernetes will, do its Kubernetes things of distributing your workloads across them. But the cloud providers created these convenient plugins where you can add the plugin to your cluster. Now, of course, it'll be outside, so you actually have to add it. Before, it was just kind of there, where the cluster will know a little bit about the environment that it's working in, the cloud, and be able to have some nice kind of convenient integrations, even if you're running the cluster yourself. So that's who this is affecting, is if you're running clusters yourself from scratch on these cloud providers, Azure, GCE, and vSphere, and you use this cloud provider plugin. Actually, even if you're not using it, it sounds like the control plane and the API server and one other piece of the control plane of the cluster.
Yeah.
A couple of parts of the control plane might have trouble because they'll be like, oh, I'm supposed to have this cloud provider plugin, but I don't now because it's now out of tree. So make sure that you follow these remediation steps if you are running your own clusters in these environments and might want to use the cloud provider functionality. Does that sound like a fairly good description, Priyanka?
Yes. And
cool.
A last minute note, I would love to also talk about who is not going to be impacted so that people don't worry about this. So anybody who is not on Azure, GCE, or vSphere, they are not impacted. And anybody who is on AWS and OpenStack, just a note, those two cloud provider integrations were also there at some point historically, but they were removed in 126 and 127 from the Kubernetes source code. Mm-hmm. So if anybody is on those two cloud providers, they are also not impacted. And outside of these five, Azure, GCE, vSphere, AWS, and OpenStack, anybody who is on any other cloud provider, they don't have to worry about this because other providers beyond these five listed were never included in Kubernetes code. And as such, they will begin their life as external cloud controller managers. So that's it.
Again, if you're using a managed service like AKS or GKE, then also you shouldn't have to worry about this.
Yep.
Cool. So that's the one breaking change. Everyone who runs their own clusters in a cloud provider, specifically Azure, GCE, or vSphere, make sure that you go check out that blog post so that you know exactly how to mitigate that issue.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the other big changes, though, that are happening in this release, because there are some other very exciting things, especially some very old KEPs even, that are finally getting included in 1.29. So what have you got?
Yeah, I think there is one KEP which is much anticipated from the community. I think the discussion started like in 2015 and while we were discussing version 1.17 and finally they are landing into 1.29 as alpha. I'm talking about KEP 1287. It's for in-place update of pod resources and it's graduating as alpha this cycle. A bit on this KEP, what this does is this will actually make our pod API spec mutable. So, historical context, resources which we allocate to pod containers can require a change for many reasons. Some examples, for example, if the load handled by the pod has increased significantly and the current resources, for example, CPU or memory we have allocated to that pod container, they are no longer sufficient and we need to provide more. So in that case, the container require a change, or the load has decreased significantly and our resources are getting wasted, they are unused, and to save those resources we need to change. Or resources have been simply been set improperly, we need to set them correctly. So in all these scenarios, there has always been a requirement to change these resources on our pod containers, but without restarting them. So right now we can do that. We can change resources like CPU or memory consumption and allocation on any pod containers, but we need to restart our pod. This KEP actually brings that very much wanted functionality from the, which basically in short make our pod spec resources field mutable. So now we do not have to no longer restart our pods to actually, let's say, change our CPU or memory resources we have allocated to our containers. So in 129, this KEP is coming. It's graduating as alpha. There are a lot of other details also related to this KEP on how they are making this happen, making this in-place update of port resources happen. For example, they are adding this something called resize policy for containers so that users can control how their containers are resized. Or they are also adding this another field called allocated resources to the container status in a pod status, which will describe how much node resources are allocated to a pod. So overall, this kept the functionality will help us to better utilize our resources. Yeah.
I'm very excited about this one. As I harp on many episodes, always set your pod resource requests and limits. And
yeah.
This is such an exciting update for that. And hopefully it'll make that a little bit easier for folks, because now when those resource requests and limits change, maybe if you're using like the vertical pod autoscaler or something to automatically change resources, even the pod itself doesn't have to restart in order to change those resources. So it can do it much less disruptively, which is exciting. And it sounds like as part of this KEP, which as you said is a very old KEP that folks have wanted for a very long time, as part of this, it sounds like there's also some additional fields that are going to make it a little bit easier to control the resources of the pod, the allocated and...
Yeah, that's correct.
What was the other one you mentioned?
Allocated resources is one that will give us some more information in the status section. So status is the section of any Kubernetes resource object, for example, that gives us information of the applied resource. So whatever is actually running inside our Kubernetes cluster, what's the status of that? We have added a new field called allocated resources there to get some more information. Yeah, in general, you also touched on vertical autoscaling and horizontal autoscaling. There is a bit of implementation details coming out on those sides as well as part of this KEP. So yeah, look for documentation.
Awesome. So I'm very excited about this change. I mean, anything that makes pod operations less disruptive is going to be a good thing. And I think folks will make good use of this. And I hope to see stories about use cases, because use cases are my favorite in the future. But there's also another major change in this release, right? And it's also one that I've heard a lot about. 753, the sidecar containers one, which we've talked about on the podcast before as well, right?
Yeah. So 753, this is a major KEP that was very much talked about during 128 as well, when it was alpha. In 129, it is graduating to beta. And I'll just give like a brief overview of what sidecar containers are and maybe like touch a bit on what is coming, what is changing in 129.
I've had to explain sidecar container basics to a lot of folks recently because of this KEP, which is great. I love explaining sidecars. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So for everyone who is listening, I had to go do my homework to actually learn about all the enhancements that we are discussing here. So for me also, I have my notes and I'm just going through them. So for me, if I have to explain sidecar containers to somebody, this is from the docs. They explain it as any traditional init containers that we have in our pods with the added always restart policy. So if you have to explain sidecar containers, it's traditional init containers with an always restart policy. That's what sidecar containers are.
Sometimes the perspective of Kubernetes on these concepts is slightly different from the concept of like other projects and users. The way that I often explain sidecar containers is just the general concept of like you have a pod and you have your main container that has the app running in it that you actually care about. And then you have something else, some other container right there within the pod that's sharing network, it's sharing storage, it's sharing all of the resources. So that allows it to do really cool things with the application, like collecting logs or intercepting traffic or all kinds of things. So it's used very commonly in service meshes. But the perspective of Kubernetes is really cool because it looks at it as like a specific type of container within the pod itself. It's very cool. There's a lot of like kind of trickiness to explaining exactly how this KEP affects sidecars. So if you want to talk more about the changes to init containers that Kubernetes is doing with this KEP.
Yeah, actually, you explained it very well. And whatever you discussed about sidecar containers right now are actually the major uses. Like people know sidecars from those use cases. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's coming in 129 for this particular KEP is this KEP is actually graduated to beta now, or will be graduating to beta once we release 129.
Which is the main thing, right? In 1.28, we also talked about this KEP a lot. So definitely check out the 1.28 episode if you want more. But
yes. So what changes between 128 and 129 now is this is going to be there enabled by default in 129 and starting 129, let's say. That was not the case in 128 when it was alpha. People had to use the feature gates, enable the feature gates, and then only they were able to use the sidecar containers. But now starting from 129, since it's graduating to beta, it will be enabled by default. And what change would happen is anytime with beginning with Kubernetes 129, if your pod includes one or more of these sidecar containers, which is init containers with an always restart policy, Kubelet will delay sending the terminate signals to these sidecar containers so that until our last main container has fully terminated, these will stay there. So that's the whole idea of sidecar containers and this KEP, that sidecar container stays alive till our main containers are alive.
yeah. The cool thing about Kubernetes' perspective on this, I think, is that we would think of sidecars as it has access to all of this stuff, and so you can use it to do all of these cool things. But from Kubernetes' perspective, it's like, all right, you put a different container into the pod, and the container needs to live as long as the other container in the pod lives. All right, we'll do that.
Yeah, that's exactly it is. Yeah. And I was just saying the sidecar containers, if you have multiple of them, they will be terminated in reverse order. So whichever started first will be the one like terminated last. Yeah. However you are defining them in your pod spec, in the reverse order of that, they will be terminated. That's all about this KEP. This is going to be enabled by default.
Yeah. The Kubernetes perspective of things is all about like what Kubernetes has to do with it, not what you are going to do with it, which makes it a little hard to understand things sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So that's in beta, so it's enabled by default now. So this shouldn't break anything. It's not considered a breaking change, but it is a cool new feature for folks who want to use the sidecar pattern for their applications running in Kubernetes.
Yes.
So beyond those two major changes, there's a lot of other changes in 1.29, right?
Yeah, I think there are a few stable changes. Like there are a few features that are going GA this cycle. I would love to talk about some of them. The first one that I want to talk about is from SIG Oath, and we are talking about KEP 3299. It's about KMS version 2 improvements, or KMS v2. I'll start with a bit of explanation on like a backstory about this, and then we'll come to that because this was one of the KEPs that took me the most time to understand what this is doing. But it's brilliant. Like I learned a lot. So backstory is, if for all the APIs in Kubernetes that allows us or let us write persistent API data in etcd, they support something called at-rest encryption. So for example, we take an example of secret objects. If we want to store secrets inside etcd, with using this at-rest encryption, what we can do is we can ask Kube API server, please encrypt our data first before you store them in etcd, and encrypt it with some specified encryption algorithm. So I will provide you what encryption algorithm you have to use. Use that, encrypt it, and then put it in etcd. And how that happens is Kube API server process accepts some argument called encryption provider config. This is like a flag where we pass a file in front of it, and that file actually contains an API object. And in that API object, we define like what kind of encryption algorithms we have to use to encrypt our data, or more precisely address data, which is going to be like there in etcd. So in that file, we have this field called resources.providers. And in front of that particular field is what take the name of our encryption algorithms, and that's where KMS v2 come in. So we have like these many different encryption algorithms we can use, called something like AES GCM or AES CBC. Those I'm reading from the documentation, or like referring from the whatever is specified in the documentation. AES GCM or AES CBC, they are good, but they are weak in terms of security and not so fast. And that's where like KMS version 2 came in. What this KMS version 2 encryption provider or encryption scheme does is it uses an envelope encryption scheme. So to define it like in very simple words, if I as a user I'm asking my Kube API server, let's create or update a resource and first like encrypt it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this query to as an API request to Kube API server, and Kube API server in turn, before adding that data or that resource YAML, for example, in before storing that in etcd, what it will do is it will do some process to encrypt that. In case of KMS version 2, what it does is Kube API server first creates something called DEKs, called data encryption keys, and then it sends that DEK to KMS plugin, key management server plugin, and asks KMS plugin to actually encrypt that DEK. But KMS plugin does not encrypt that on its own. We are talking about Kube API server and KMS plugin inside the cluster. KMS plugin actually asks another entity which resides outside the cluster called external KMS to give it like a key called KEK or K encryption key, and that is what this plugin uses to encrypt our DKs, and then Kube API server uses that encrypted DEK to encrypt our data, and that encrypted data is then stored in etcd. So this whole process is actually implemented and improved by many folds as part of this KEP. This whole envelope encryption scheme of Kube API server asking KMS plugin to encrypt something, and KMS plugin in turn asking the external KMS to encrypt the DKs, and then giving all those stuff back to Kube API server. So whole that process is improved as part of this KEP. And what has happened as a result of that is, if we talk about the version 1 of KMS, and there is like this test that was conducted which created 12,000 secret objects, and they measured the time taken for this API server to encrypt the resources. In case of KMS version 1, the time taken was around 160 milliseconds. But in case of KMS version 2, the time was actually decreased by 2,000 times. So
Whoa.
to encrypt like the same 12,000 secret objects, it just took 80 microseconds.
Wow.
So,
And with a slightly more secure version, right?
Yeah.
Of encryption.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it gave us like a 2,000 times speed boost. So that is amazing.
Yeah.
And this change is coming as a stable change in 1.29. This was beta in 1.27, and from let's say beta to stable now, what is this functionality which I just tried to describe, I think it was kind of implemented partly in alpha beta as well. They added more like features to it in 1.29 now. One of the things they did is they added tracing to this entire process of Kube API server talking to KMS plugin, and then KMS plugin
Wow.
in turn talking to the external KMS. They added some functionality to trace this encrypt operations. They also added a reference implementation this cycle. So they added a reference implementation using PKC S11, public key cryptographic standard 11. They use something called soft HSM. So using this reference implementation, somebody can create a mock KMS plugin for testing purpose. And one thing to note here is this reference implementation is actually just for testing purpose only. It's not for production use. So only if you just want to perform tests and like want to understand more about this particular feature, you can use that reference implementation. But for everything else right now, I think production use, it's better to use the cloud provider KMS plugins. For example, we have one from GCP. There is something from AWS as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
they have their plugins.
I feel like diving deep into this encryption, like I didn't expect to go to this level of, of security today, but I'm excited that we're here. I feel like when you dive into this level of encryption protocols and security, one common trend is that it kind of distributes. There's more and more pieces to it, which require authentication and all of this work. And this sounds like a really thorough and
Oh yeah,
even including tracing in this whole process of like including these extra steps into the encryption to make it better is very cool.
yeah. I mean, it took me like the most time to understand this, Kev, because
It's very deep.
there is a lot of stuff happening, yeah, here, and to understand what are DEKs and what are KEKs and who is using them, who is creating them, all those pieces. But I would say the KEP owners or authors, they have done a brilliant job of with the docs. They have these brilliant diagrams there to explain like what is happening where, the entire flow. And so if
Yeah.
anybody who wants to use it, they have made it like pretty easy for them to understand. If I can understand it, I think somebody who is going to actually start using it, they can definitely understand that.
Which is a good sign. We talked to the SIG etcd folks a couple of episodes ago, so I feel like talking to them about this would also be really cool.
Yep.
But there's also a few more stable, well, you said there were 11 total, right? But are there any other stable caps that you want to highlight?
Yeah. So there is one from SIG storage that's also interesting. So we have 3 access modes right now before 129. Access modes for PV and PVCs, persistent volumes and persistent volume claims, which currently are read write ones, read only many, and read write many.
Mm-hmm.
We have this new KEP coming in from SIG storage. The KEP number is 2485. It's called read write once port persistent volume access mode. So it's like from the name itself, it's very obvious. They are trying to add a new access mode, and that's very interesting to what this access mode does. So read write once port is an access mode for PVs and PVCs, which was actually introduced in 122, and that's going stable this cycle. What this access mode does is it enables you to restrict your volume access. So you have a persistent volume in your cluster, and you can restrict the access of that particular PV to just single port in your entire cluster. So this particular new access mode, which is going GA in 129, allows you to do that. This is very much important in situations like when we are talking about stateful workloads, for example, that require single writer access to storage. So in those kind of cases, this new access mode is, it's not new actually, it was there from 122, but it's going to be like there by default now, starting from 129. And this particular access mode allows us to do that, allows us to have single writer access to storage. One thing like I would want to highlight here is it's very easy just from the names of these different access modes we have. It's very easy to confuse this new one, read write once port, with one we have from past read write ones.
Mm-hmm. Pod versus not pod.
Yeah, exactly. The one with the port and the one without a port. So the difference between these two is read write once, which is the one without port. That's also access mode, but that restricts the volume access to a single node, not a single port. So that access mode, if you are using, like if you are creating a persistent volume with that access mode, which means anything on that volume could be accessed by multiple ports on the same node. But what this read write once port does, that it just restricts it to one port in the entire whole cluster. So that is where like this new access mode is important.
One thing I'm always explaining to folks who are new to Kubernetes is you might not know where your workload gets deployed to. It might be on the same virtual machine as another one, or it might not be. So this helps to kind of manage that, where you can restrict access to storage just to a specific pod. So you might have several copies of a pod as part of a deployment, all doing the same thing. And if they both get deployed to the same node, then they try to write to the same storage, you might have trouble. So this helps to address that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And This mode is actually available by default from 127, but 129 and later it's actually GA, and
Stable.
the Kubernetes
Yeah.
API recognizes this. Yeah.
Awesome. Good stuff.
And one more I have. I think that's a quick one. That's from SIG instrumentation. It's kept 727 kubelet resource metrics endpoint. So a bit of backstory on this one. We have something called Kubelet Summary API. That API actually is a source of two things to us. Number one, it provides us some data on some meta on resource metrics. And the other thing it does is provides some information on monitoring metrics. But since it is doing two things from the documentation, it's not what I'm saying. It says because it's a dual purpose, it does a poor job of both.
Yeah, I love this. And one thing we were talking about earlier is I tried to do a little bit of research for this, of course. And I was going through the KEPs and I realized that there's actually two different places where you can find KEP information. Traditionally, when I've tried to look up a KEP, I've looked up the issue that is the KEP, which honestly does not tell you much. If you actually want to learn about the KEP, there's not a lot of information there. The issues are mainly for tracking like the progress of getting the KEP into Kubernetes and like releasing it. But there's also a README for the KEPs, which is really where you want to go if you want to learn about KEPs. And that's where this great line comes from of because it's dual purpose, it does a poor job of both.
Yeah, and just adding to that README, right next to that README, there is another file called kep.yaml that can give you like a historical context of who owns this particular feature, who are the supporting SIGs, or when this kep was alpha, beta, or when it is scheduled. For example, if it's going to be, let's say, planned to be GA in some other future release cycle, you can get those kind of information from that kep.yaml file as well. So yeah, both README, kep README we call it, and kep YAML file. Those are the places where you would want to look at to understand about any kep. And now back to this kep 727. We were talking about Kubelet Summary API, doing two things and not doing good at any of them. The 727 Kubelet Resource Metrics endpoint, this basically deals with the first use case of Summary API, which is getting resource metrics, or in simple terms, getting information on CPU and memory metrics for pods and nodes. So this kep actually proposes that we should have a purpose-built API for supplying these resource metrics, and
instead of doing a poor job of both.
yeah. And so in 129, it's actually going GA. The resource metrics API will be there, and
Nice.
I think it was there from previous releases as well. Specifically in 129, they are graduating few metrics endpoints to general availability, and I'll not read through that list of what all is coming as part of this kep. I think docs will do a better job of that. But some points, like it's going to provide us information like container CPU usage, seconds total, container memory working set bytes, and all these kind of new fields are coming in to provide us better data on our resource metrics.
Always important to have better metrics, especially on resources. Set your resource requests and limits.
Yeah, this one reminds me of the one kep we discussed like early on, in place update of port resources. So 1287, 727, yeah, both of these are important if you are looking for optimizing your resources.
Which please do. The more efficient we are, the better.
Yeah.
And then there were a couple more keps that we wanted to highlight from beta and alpha, right?
Yeah, I think beta, I have one very specifically. We talked about one during major changes, which was Sidecar. So Sidecar is actually graduating to beta as well. One another on like side I want to talk about is KEP 2799. The title is Reduction of Secret-Based Security Account Tokens. This KEP will also require some sort of backstory to understand what this is doing. We know about this concept called service account in Kubernetes. So a service account is something that provides an identity for processes that runs inside a pod containers.
It's kind of an account for a service, right? An account for a thing, a workload.
That's exactly it is. Yeah, an account that provides identity. And here in this case, we are talking about identity for the processes that are running inside our pod containers. So any process inside a pod can use this identity of its associated service account to authenticate actually to the cluster API server. And we do not want these service accounts to be always present there. So that is what is the concern of this particular KEP, that before 122, we used to have these legacy service account tokens. In simple terms, we used to have these service account objects inside our Kubernetes cluster that used to add a volume based on a secret, where secret represented a service account for the pod, and that secret had some value that used to never expire. So if when a pod needed that service account, and the service account is automatically created, but now the pod does not no longer uses it, there is no way, like, since we did not have any expiry for those kind of service account tokens, that was a problem, because now these service account tokens are lying there and anybody can use them, like any other entity, any other unwanted entity in the Kubernetes cluster can use them. So this KEP actually proposes some actions to reduce the surface area of those legacy service account tokens.
Interesting.
And what they have done from starting from 129, so there is this feature gate they have added. I think it was added before in alpha, but that was not enabled by default. In 129, that will be enabled by default, and we are talking about this feature gate called legacy service account token cleanup. So by the name itself, its work is to actually clean those legacy service account tokens which are no longer used by any pod. And the implementation detail is very interesting here. So what it does is, if this feature gate is enabled, which it will be by default in 129, so any legacy auto-generated service account token secrets, they will be auto-labeled with a label called kubernetes.io/legacy token invalid since. So if a pod is not using like a service account token which is lying there in our clusters, like let's say for a year, now Kubernetes will itself add like a label to it, legacy token invalid since. Like it will add a label to it with that date, and now it will wait like for another year. If for that another year, or we can specify that time period as well, if no other pod still uses that lying around legacy service account token, that will be deleted. So that is the intention of this KEP.
So it's like very slow garbage collection of secrets that are sitting around and being a security risk.
Yeah, we want to make sure, like, we do not want to delete tokens
that are being used.
If by any slight chance, they might be used. So we are like giving enough time. 1 year is default, but we can specify like what kind of cleanup period we want to have. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like when I get a chance to dive into IAM and like any kind of identity management stuff, at first it seems terrifyingly obscure and very hard to understand, which it is. But any chance I get to actually dive into it, I feel like the implementations of those types of features and tools are very interesting. And this is the same.
Yeah, they mostly work on these labels and annotations. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And the tie-in with secrets and the classic don't use secrets for things that you actually want to keep secret, because the level of security that they actually provide within Kubernetes is somewhat minimal. So avoiding secrets wherever possible is also a common trend in Kubernetes.
Yeah, correct. Cool. I agree with you. Like, if you just start looking at one component of Kubernetes, it's such a whole learning journey. You will start from somewhere and you will end up somewhere, and there'll still be like a lot of things.
And still so many things you don't know
to explore. Yeah.
Like Joe Beta has said in the past, Kubernetes is too big for any one person to understand at this point.
Oh,
so
yeah. Very sure. Yeah. And coming to the last one. Yeah. So we have one alpha KEP, which is interesting. This one is from SIG Network. It's KEP 3866. Simple. This is for NF tables, kube proxy backend. So what this KEP is doing, it's still in alpha. So if you want to use it, you have to enable it through feature gates. But it is actually making NF tables as a available mode, where you can like start using NF tables for configuring your packet forwarding rules. This proxy mode is actually just available for Linux nodes right now. It's not available for any other nodes. So, and also this NF tables API is actually like kind of a successor to the IP tables API, which is, let's say, the mode right now.
Yeah. And there was actually a talk on this at the Contributor Summit. I think it was recorded. I'll try to have a link to that talk in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah. So this NF tables is actually meant to be a successor to IP tables, but right now it's in alpha, and
Yeah.
even like the people who have actually created it right now, they don't really expect it to outperform other Linux mode at this point of time. But let's say in further iteration, when it graduates to beta and GA, we can see that coming.
Yeah, the talk featured some very interesting discussion around the trade-offs of whether we should use IP tables or NF tables as the kube proxy backend. And the main point from that is sticking in my brain is that they were saying a lot of the Linux community is moving away from IP tables in general and moving toward NF tables.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of the successor to IP tables, even beyond just this use case within Kubernetes with kube proxy, kind of in the Linux ecosystem in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So we made it through all of the KEPs. Thank you to everyone who's stuck with us this far. I have just a couple more questions that I want to ask you before we wrap up. Number one, what were you most excited about for this release?
So for me, I think this opportunity to be the release lead was the most exciting part, because this is my first time like stepping into a role where I'm working as a people manager or a project manager, and actually a mixture of both. And I'd be honest, I had like a lot of learning to do during the entire time, and I learned and I grew a lot. So that was the most exciting part for me, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. And being a release lead is a huge job. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of leadership skills that you can gain from it.
Yeah. Correct. And I was a lead shadow twice before. So I've been part of release team from 123 till 127. I was not on 128, and then I now came back on 129. So I was a release lead shadow for 126 and 127. I think at that point, if I can't imagine what are the, like, I'm trying to recall if when I was in 126 and 127 as a lead shadow, do I had any idea of what really it means to be a release lead? I think no.
Yeah. It's hard to understand, right?
Yeah, you get to know when you actually step into the role and you have to like take care of everything.
Such as open source.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we started from that and ended up a full circle.
Coming back to it.
Yeah. So yeah, just getting into that role and having this whole journey of learning like so many things, not just the release processes, but everything outside that. It was amazing.
Around leadership and like management of all of the different interests involved and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and making sure people are happy, community, release team members, and while making sure all that is there to still put the release out. Yeah.
Yeah. Release lead is kind of a service role, right? Service and leadership.
Yeah.
Making sure that the whole project is working together and releasing something awesome.
Yeah, I think one thing I loved about this release, when we started, I think I was expecting that it's going to be a bit hard this time because we had a very short code freeze time this time because of the KubeCon. KubeCon actually was scheduled for week 10. And if we look at all the release cycles that kind of like has in from past, code freeze kind of lands in week 10 or week 11. But we were not able to do either of those because...
Yeah, that's a tough time to have a freeze.
Yeah, we want people like before the code freeze week, we want the approvers and reviewers from the community to be available, but that was not happening. So we had to like really prepone the code freeze to week 9, which actually gave people very less time to implement the features. So that is where like we got 72 in, and it's still like I can't believe how we managed. It's not our work actually, it's like community's work.
So many people.
How people managed to have the code implemented as well, and we got some very long-standing KEPs as well in. So yeah,
amazing.
Yeah,
awesome. I'm really excited for this. And for our last thing, why should listeners upgrade to 1.29? Releases are really hard. Upgrades are really hard to justify. They're a lot of pain. Why do you think our listeners should upgrade to 1.29?
I think I also share the same feeling that Kubernetes upgrades are hard, but we just discussed about 8 enhancements. Right now, there are 49 enhancements coming as part of 1.29. And 20 of them are alpha. So there are like new 20 alpha features coming as part of this cycle, and 11 of them are stable. So if you want to try any of them, test any of them, I think you would want to try using Kubernetes 1.29 for that.
Yeah, especially that in-place update of pod resources.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people will be interested in that
I think
one.
people would be happy. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's landing now finally after, I believe, how many? I can't count.
You said it started in 2015, I think?
12.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 2015, I saw an issue like that was closed recently, and that issue was opened in 2015. And if we walk up the KEP issue 1287, the KEP issue was actually started sometime in 2019 when we were discussing about version 1.17. So it's like almost 12, 13 cycles now.
I think I was talking with Tim Hawken about this at the Contributor Summit or something, and he was saying there was just so much discussion on this about how they were going to do it. It took a very long time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Every cycle, like, if I remember, like in past cycles, we have always had like exception requests coming from this particular KEP, and this is making like a lot of people happy that this is finally in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one more thing I want to mention before we wrap up here that we briefly mentioned at the beginning, but I wanted to come back to, is the release did get delayed by about a week. And I was just talking with another community member who's been part of the community for a very long time, Josh Burkus, and he was saying that the reason for this delay is probably the most common reason that Kubernetes ends up delaying releases is that there was a CVE found in Go.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, security holes in Go are the most common cause of release delays.
Yeah. We got like a report it was like a pre-announcement for a security fix releases coming for 120 point something and 121 point something Go versions. And those are actually landing on our original intended release date. So
Yeah.
we decided to wait for those CV fixes to come and then decided to move ahead with them. And before we actually wrap up, I have one more kind of an announcement or a reminder for everyone in the community. So legacy Linux packages repositories will be going away sometime early 2024. So please migrate to the Kubernetes community owned packages repositories. And by legacy package repositories, I mean the apt.kubernetes.io and yum.kubernetes.io, which are kind of like endpoints to packages.cloud.google.com. So those will be going away. And there are 2 blogs for them if you have to migrate.
And we've done a couple episodes talking about it as well.
Oh, yeah. So there are a lot of resources out there, but make the move now. It's finally happening. Those repositories will be gone sometime early 2024.
Migrate to the Kubernetes owned repositories, please. It's very important.
Yeah. pkgs packages.kubernetes.io.
Yeah. And with that, this is a very big episode for a very big release. Thank you so much, Priyanka, for giving us such great insights into all of these many, many changes that are going into 1.29, a lot of really important ones. I'm excited for folks to try out the release. Thank you very much for being on, Priyanka.
Thank you for hosting me. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Well, Kathleen, thank you for that interview. That was really cool. A lot of details.
Always a pleasure. Also super exciting to get to interview my co-lead in SIG Contribex. So
Yeah, you already work together.
Yep. Always good to get to chat more. We're in very different time zones, so sometimes it's difficult.
Oh, where is Priyanka based?
India. I don't remember where
India?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay. It was actually pretty cool that they went to quite a lot of details in the conversation about the most important KEP, which there are 2 of them I am very excited about, and we're going to get to talk about them. But before we do that, let's talk about the theme.
Yes. The logo is so gorgeous. I finally did get to look at it, and it's so pretty.
Yeah, I have it open in front of me. I also found the text or the chat that Priyanka mentioned in Slack, where somebody noticed that they integrated
the numbers.
So 1.29 in Devanagari. I hope I'm not saying that wrong. Devanagari numbers.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the logo, or you look at the logo for the theme, and you read it from left to right, it's 1 on the left, dot on the top, 2 on the right side, and 9 in the bottom.
They look gorgeous. I can't read them, but
it looks amazing. I'm looking forward to have this as a sticker on my laptop, actually.
Yes, that would be so cool.
Yeah, so we were chatting before we started recording, and I told you that once I heard in the interview the integrated number, I stopped and I went to look at the logo, and I was able actually to read the numbers.
That's so cool.
I've never even heard about this script, which apparently is popular in North India, the way they write numbers, right? Mm-hmm. And then we were chatting about a fun fact, which is the way we write numbers in the West, people think those are Arab numbers, but they are not. They are Hindu Arabic numbers. Arab numbers are completely different.
And then these ones are yet a different kind of Indian. It must have some connection to Arabic as well, right?
Yes, they look similar to Arabic. So when I was studying in Morocco, obviously we speak Arabic and French. So we were writing, for example, dates. When you write it on, like, when you have a paper and you write a date, you write it in both. So then in the Arabic, you just use the Arabic numbers or the actual Arabic numbers, not what the rest of the world think the Arabic numbers are. So if you're listening to this episode, go to Wikipedia and look Arabic numbers, and you will see similarities between the Arabic numbers and the Devanagari numbers.
I love language fun facts.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Especially natural ones. But it's so cool how they integrated so much meaning into the logo.
Yeah.
There are releases where it's just a fun logo and it's just cool to look at and enjoy. This one, they were like, no, it has all of the meaning. Talking about Kubernetes, it's the universe, it's got the numbers. It's fantastic. I really enjoy it.
Yeah. So for the reference, the theme is mandala.
Yeah, which we talked about in the interview, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea that meant universe until this interview.
Oh, yes. I was actually looking at the meaning. I'm looking at the release page for the release. We'll leave a link in the show notes. But yeah, let's go into details. 72 keps.
It's ridiculous.
It's a lot.
I think that was what they started out with, right? But they ended up with like 40 some, which is still ridiculous.
Which is still quite a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that probably a couple of the one that were really the most interesting is the removing the in-tree code, like cloud providers in-tree code.
Oh, yes. Yeah. The cloud provider removal bit. Yeah.
Correct. So that's basically removing everything that is cloud specific from in-tree. And by in-tree, I mean in a tree.
Yeah. Within the tree of Kubernetes. Within Kubernetes' own code. Yeah. This is I think I mentioned in the episode as well that this in-tree, out-of-tree thing is such a fascinating trend throughout the project to me. Because we've talked about before on the 1.28 release interview.
Yeah.
A lot of the major changes in that one were also removing storage providers from in-tree to out-of-tree. So I'm noticing a theme that a lot of the things that we're moving out of the tree of Kubernetes are vendor-specific things, which makes a lot of sense to move out of the open source project itself. They're more like plugins that you can use if you need them. But if they're integrated into the project, then they have to follow the project's release cycle, and there's all kinds of problems.
Yeah. I think that also kind of keeps Kubernetes, like makes the projects more maintainable.
Yeah. That's
in a way.
The main goal of actually doing this.
And also give people options, because then you can choose whatever plugin you want, right?
Yeah. And it minimizes the complexity and the size of Kubernetes itself as much as we can, so that you can just use what you need. And then also you get better pieces for those pieces, because the individual vendors can manage the release cycles of those plugins themselves, rather than being tied to Kubernetes and then everybody has to work together, and we know how that works.
Exactly. Yeah, there was quite a lot of, we're not going to go into all the details, but the page that describes the deprecations and enhancements or the changes in general in 1.29, we'll have a link for it in the show notes. But like the part you discussed, which was interesting, is this is going to impact people who are doing self-hosted Kubernetes on top of things like GCE, Google Compute Engine, Azure, or what was the third one? vSphere, right?
Yeah. And I think this is something that trips folks up a lot who are not very familiar with the Kubernetes space. It's like Kubernetes is an open source project, and you can run it on computers to kind of tie them together as a distributed system. You can do that yourself, or you can have someone else do it.
Yes.
The people this will affect are the people who are doing that themselves.
Yeah. To be precise, self-manage, which means you deploy Kubernetes yourself using something like kubeadm or kubespray or cluster API or something like that.
Or pain and suffering of understanding the deep level components of Kubernetes itself. And
yes, that's what Kelsey Hightower
doing it the hard way.
Called Kubernetes the hard way. Exactly.
Precisely.
Cool.
Also, by the way, I wrote a blog post about the in-tree, out-of-tree thing, so I'll put a link for that in the show notes in case people...
I saw that one, yeah. I haven't read it yet, but I saw it.
I had a lot of fun doing that.
Nice. So there was another one which actually you started talking about, and it's so funny because I am literally writing an article with a colleague of mine in Europe about this specific feature, which is the in-place resource changes, essentially being able to add the memory or CPU to pods without restarting them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such an interesting one.
Yeah. So what we're writing a blog about, it's a use case. I think you didn't discuss it, but here is the use case. If you're running Java apps on Kubernetes, Java apps typically need a lot of CPU at the beginning of the startup of the application to be able to load all the classes. So all the auto-scaling mechanisms in Kubernetes doesn't work because you only need that CPU memory during the startup phase. And then the app might not need these resources while it's running, right?
Interesting.
So Kubernetes has something called the CPU boost feature, which was released in, I think, 1.28. And paired with these in-place resource updates, you can essentially create a CPU boost resource that will give more CPU to the pod during a specific period of its startup phase or when the app is starting, and then it will just remove that CPU with the in-place resource changes.
Cool. I had no idea about this use case, which makes the whole change a lot more interesting.
Yes.
It was already interesting, but...
Yeah. I don't think that they introduced it as a way for this specific use case, but it's just one kind of common use case, right?
Yeah, but it's one where this is particularly relevant, and I think that's great.
Yeah.
A great way to understand how it works.
Exactly. We're actually working on an article that will be hopefully coming out soon, and it has even a demo that shows a Spring Boot app, and it compares performance of startup of the app when you use the CPU boost with in-place resource changes compared to not without CPU boost.
Interesting. All right, I look forward to that.
Yeah.
More reading on my list.
Yeah. And then there was the sidecar feature going to beta.
Yes. I've been explaining that to folks a lot. I think I mentioned that in the interview as well. I've encountered quite a few folks recently, especially students and folks newer to the community and newer to the industry who still need, there's a lot of folks who need an overview of what a sidecar is, because it's kind of a weird concept. If you've been following the service mesh space, which we have, so sidecars are oh yeah, we talked about that 2 years ago. Or more than that, maybe, sidecars were the big thing. So it's oh yeah, they're doing the sidecar thing. We get that. But a lot of folks, the concept of a sidecar is still very new. If you weren't following the service mesh space, or if you don't work with service meshes, I feel it's not something that you would have thought about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but it's not only relevant for service mesh. It's only relevant for things logging and monitoring, right? If you run a logger next to your app. So, we have discussed this feature many, many times before of what this means. But what I still find very interesting is it took Kubernetes close to 10 years. It's 10 years in September next year, right? For the community to come around and decide, just for the reference, in Kubernetes, the concept of sidecar is not an actual concept. It's a convention. It's just a common thing that people agreed that we're going to call this a sidecar.
Yeah. It was just a naturally developed way of doing things.
Exactly. So it's just very fascinating that it took almost 10 years for people to go okay, well, now we need an actual fix.
Well, granted, how much of an actual fix is it? It's taking a thing that already existed within Kubernetes. It's very much the concept of a sidecar itself. It kind of develops naturally from the existing capabilities of Kubernetes. It's not there's a brand new thing that is sidecars, and we've been talking about these forever, and now Kubernetes has them. No, it's just Kubernetes was oh yeah, this pattern is a thing. Here's a better way to do that with the existing functionality.
Yes, and for the reference, what Kathleen is talking about, the fix is taking init containers which already existed and just adding a field to them. That's it. That's the fix.
Yeah, that's all it is. And it was discussed. Folks discussed the possibility of creating a full new thing that's a sidecar container,
an actual resource,
resource within Kubernetes. And it was just going to be way too disruptive to the whole project. So this was the easiest way to get it done without breaking anything.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting. And there was quite a lot of KEPs that were discussed. I don't want to go into all the details.
There were a lot. It's a long episode. We thank you for getting to this part.
Yes, thank you for sticking with us. I think there was some CMS stuff, and there was some new read-write mode thingy with storage that was introduced.
Yeah.
But I think the most important, probably if you are still here, is remember the migration from the repositories, right? Moving from the Google-owned repositories or Google-hosted repositories to the community-hosted repositories.
Yes. I need to write several blog posts about that. Everybody move your stuff. People are not going to move it. I know this. And it's going to be a whole thing. They're going to turn it off, and there's going to be a firestorm on Twitter somewhere.
Yes.
Somewhere within Twitter, people will be upset.
Yeah. While I was preparing for this episode, I saw I think in Hacker News, some article, somebody wrote a blog that says Kubernetes needs an LTS. So it sounds like some of these long-term maintainability topics are going to stick around for a while.
They're working on that. There's a long-term support working group within the open source project right now. Yeah. Microsoft and a bunch of other vendors are on board trying to figure out what long-term support looks like in Kubernetes. It's very interesting when you start diving into it, how complicated it gets to be well, we need people to upgrade, but it's really hard for them to upgrade, and we know that, and we need to support them, but also we still need to support them upgrading eventually. So
yes,
there's a lot of considerations that go into how you make it possible to stay on the same version longer while still keeping you from getting yourself into a bad state as much as possible.
Yeah.
Which we know some people want the ability to shoot themselves in the foot, but so that's another consideration that goes into it.
Yeah. I mean, jokes aside, with all jokes made about this topic, I think it's a very important topic.
It is.
Maintainability and sustainability when you run Kubernetes is important, right?
Very, very important.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, for the interview. That was pretty cool.
Of course. It was my pleasure to get to do that. And I learned so much. It was so awesome that Priyanka went through and grabbed a whole bunch of KEPs to talk about, and she did a bunch of reading because as we talked about on previous release episodes, the job of the release lead is really about coordinating all of the different interest groups involved in a Kubernetes release more than it is about understanding the technical details of the release itself. But Priyanka is a tech lead for a reason. She went in and just learned all the things, and so we were able to talk about it. That was really awesome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Priyanka, as well.
Yeah.
And with that, this is our last episode of 2023.
Yay! We've made it as the hosts of this podcast for a whole year now. Folks.
Yes.
Can you believe it?
Yes, I am.
How we've grown.
Yes, we learned a lot. Definitely learned a lot.
Thank you for sticking with us or for joining us. We appreciate having you.
Yeah, thank you for everybody who listened, who left nice feedback. We'll try to do more cool, interesting stuff next year. And what are your plans for the holidays, Kathleen?
Oh, I'm going to visit family. And then my partner and I, we always host a New Year's party where we watch Asian New Year's programs, because the Korean program and the Japanese New Year's programs, they go all out. The Korean program is a review of all of the pop music for the year, and the Japanese program has all these fun little activities that they do with stars and stuff. So they're fantastic to watch, and that's what we do for New Year's.
Awesome. Nice. I'll be spending my Christmas and New Year's back home in Morocco. I'm trying to run away from the cold in Sweden. So
understandable.
So I'll just be with my family, eating good food and being taken care of. So
we hope you all have a wonderful and pleasant holiday season, whatever that may mean for you. And we'll see you next year in 2024.
Yes, we'll see you next year. Goodbye.
Bye. That brings us to the end of another episode. If you enjoyed this show, please help us spread the word and tell a friend. If you have any feedback for us, you can find us on social media at KubernetesPod or reach us by email at kubernetespodcast@google.com. You can also check out the website at kubernetespodcast.com, where you'll find transcripts and show notes and links to subscribe. Please consider rating us in your podcast player so we can help more people find and enjoy the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.